really, really bad news. The first Monday was 2 weeks ago. Today, my father passed away, a long bout with illness, passed away peacefully.
There are certain moments in a person's life that divide everything into before and after, not the dramatic moments that play out in public, not the career milestones or the headlines or the occasions that get photographed and remembered, but the quiet, private ones, the ones that arrive without warning and leave a person fundamentally changed in ways that no camera ever fully captures. For Mark Consuelos, that moment came at 55 years old, and the man who emerged on the other side of it was recognizably the same person the world had followed for decades, but carrying something heavier than he had ever carried before. Understanding what happened to Mark Consuelos and what it actually cost him requires setting aside everything the public thinks it knows about celebrity grief and looking honestly at what loss does to a person when it reaches the deepest part of who they are. Mark Consuelos was born on March 30th, 1971, in Zaragoza, Spain, to an Italian father and a Spanish-Mexican mother. His family relocated to the United States when he was young, and he grew up moving between different cities as his family settled into American life. That kind of upbringing, crossing cultures, adapting to new environments, learning to carry your identity with you through constant change, tends to produce a particular kind of person, grounded, self-contained, capable of finding stability from the inside rather than depending on the outside world to provide it. Those qualities would define Mark Consuelos throughout his adult life, and they were not accidental. They were the direct inheritance of the family that raised him. His father was the original architect of the values Mark carried into everything he built, not through lectures or formal lessons, but through the slower and more lasting method of example, of watching a man handle his responsibilities with consistency, treat the people around him with respect, and prioritize the things that actually mattered over things that simply made noise. Mark absorbed all of that over years of close observation, the way children absorb the deepest truths about life, quietly, without realizing how permanently it is shaping them. Those lessons would eventually become visible in the way Mark approached his marriage, his parenting, and his career. The discipline, the loyalty, the refusal to be defined by the more excessive aspects of the industry he worked in. All of it traced back to one source. His career began to take shape after he was cast as Mateo Santos on the long-running ABC soap opera All My Children in 1995. A role that would change his life in ways that went far beyond professional opportunity. It was on that set that he met Kelly Ripa, who was already a cast member playing Haley Vaughn. Their connection was immediate and unmistakable. They married in 1996, just 1 year after meeting, in a ceremony that was small and private, entirely in keeping with who both of them were as people. They went on to have 3 children together. Michael, born in 1997, Lola, born in 2001, and Joaquin, born in 2003. The family they built together became the real center of everything Mark did, the foundation beneath every professional achievement and public milestone, the thing he returned to at the end of every day no matter what the day had held. Over the years, his career expanded steadily. He appeared in a long list of television productions, including notable roles in Riverdale, where he played Hiram Lodge with commanding intensity that introduced him to an entirely new generation of viewers. In 2023, he stepped into the co-host seat beside Kelly on Live with Kelly and Mark, officially joining what had long been the most visible professional partnership of both their lives. The show brought him into American living rooms every single morning, a position of extraordinary familiarity with a viewing public that had already followed his family's story for nearly 3 decades. By any external measure, the picture looked complete. A lasting marriage, 3 children growing into their own lives, a career that had evolved and endured, a life built with intention and protected with care. And then the loss arrived, and everything that had looked so solid was suddenly seen in a different light. The death of a parent is one of the few experiences that virtually every human being either has faced or knows is waiting for them. It does not discriminate based on wealth or achievement or the size of a person's public profile. It comes for everyone, and it comes on its own schedule, and it leaves a particular kind of absence that does not fill in the way other absences do. For Mark Consuelos, losing his father was not simply the loss of a family member. It was a loss of the original foundation, the man who had been present before any of the rest of it existed, before the career, before the marriage, before the children, before the public version of Mark Consuelos that millions of people recognized. Losing that person means losing the one relationship that predates everything else you've built, and that is a specific and devastating kind of grief that does not translate easily into words. What made it harder was the timing. By 55, Mark had reached a stage of life where the relationship with his father had become something different from what it was in childhood or early adulthood. The dynamic between a parent and a child in middle age carries a particular depth, a mutual recognition that did not exist in the early years, a kind of understanding that only develops after enough time and enough shared experience has accumulated between two people. To lose a parent at that stage of life means losing someone with whom you had finally arrived at a relationship of genuine equality and mutual appreciation, and that loss carries its own specific weight. It is not just losing the person who was once above you in the order of things. It is losing someone you had come to know as a full human being, someone whose presence in your life had become something you had quietly stopped imagining your life without. In the weeks and months that followed, Mark did what people who have always been self-contained tend to do. He kept going. He continued showing up for his professional obligations. He maintained composure that had always been part of how he presented himself to the world. But the people who knew him closely could see something different operating beneath the surface. Grief does not disappear simply because a person chooses not to display it publicly. In some ways, when it is contained and not released, it settles in deeper, becoming a constant internal weight that the person carries without any visible sign of how heavy it has gotten. That was the reality Mark was navigating, managing what was visible to the world while privately processing something that had no easy resolution. The memories that surfaced in that period were the particular cruelty of grief, not the extraordinary ones, not the milestone occasions or the significant events. The ordinary ones, the routine phone calls, the unremarkable conversations, the small habits of a relationship that had existed for decades and now had nowhere to continue. Grief has a specific way of making the ordinary feel unbearably significant in retrospect. The things you never thought to hold on to become the things you reach for most, and they are no longer available, and that absence is sharp in a way that the loss of something you consciously valued never quite is. Mark was living inside that experience, in the privacy that had always been his preference, turning over memories that were simultaneously comforting and painful in equal measure. There was also the dimension that grief almost always carries, but that people rarely speak about directly, the question of time and how it had been used. A long career in a demanding industry asks a great deal from a person. It asks for attention, energy, presence, and the willingness to keep showing up under pressure, even when the personal cost is high. Mark had given all that across 3 decades of professional life, and he had done it while also being a husband and a father and a son. But success is a way of pulling at a person's presence in ways that are nearly invisible while they're happening, and loss has a way of making those invisible costs suddenly and painfully apparent. The question of whether there had been enough time, enough fully present, undistracted, deliberate time with the person who is now gone is one of the hardest questions grief delivers, and it does not come with a satisfying answer. Kelly Ripa's response to what her husband was going through said something important about the nature of their marriage. She did not step back and wait for him to signal that he was ready for support. She moved closer. That distinction matters because the instinct to give a grieving person space, to wait until they come to you, can sometimes be its own form of absence. And Kelly seemed to understand intuitively that what Mark needed was not space. He needed consistent, uncomplicated presence. She provided that in the practical, unglamorous ways that actually sustain a person through a difficult period, not with grand gestures but with steady availability, with a willingness to sit in silence when silence was what was needed, with a particular grace of not requiring him to manage her feelings about his pain on top of his own. They had been together for nearly 30 years by this point, and that length of shared history produces an understanding between two people that cannot be replicated or accelerated. Kelly knew when to speak and when to say nothing. She knew that pushing Mark to talk before he was ready would only cause him to retreat further inward. She gave him the one thing that a private person in genuine pain most needs and least often receives: permission to not be fine, delivered not through words, but through the simple act of refusing to look away. Mark leaned on her in ways he had perhaps never needed to before, and she carried that without making a burden he had to feel guilty about. That kind of partnership, the kind that becomes most visible precisely when things are hardest, is something that takes decades of real, ordinary life to build, and what it looked like during this period revealed everything essential about what their marriage actually was beneath the public version of it. His children, Michael, Lola, and Joaquin, were also part of what held him together during this time. Watching his own children navigate the loss of their grandfather, while also navigate his own grief about losing his father, gave Mark a double perspective on what the experience meant. It placed him simultaneously in the role of grieving child and present parent, and that dual position required him to keep functioning even when his internal reserves were depleted. He did it because that was what the situation required, and because the instinct his father had modeled for him. Showing up for people who depended on you regardless of your own pain was by now so deeply embedded in who he was that it operated almost automatically. What the loss gradually produced in Mark was a shift in perspective that is common after significant grief, but is rarely described with precision. The things that had once carried a sense of urgency, the professional demands, the industry pressures, the relentless pace of maintaining a public career, began to feel smaller when placed beside what it had just been through. This was not a dramatic transformation or a public announcement of changed priorities. It was quieter than that, an internal rearrangement of what felt genuinely important versus what merely felt pressing. The career and the recognition and the obligations that came with decades of public life did not disappear, but they became easier to see in proportion. And proportion is something that grief, with its brutal honesty, has a way of restoring. He became more deliberate, more present in the moments that actually mattered, less likely to let the noise of a demanding industry pull his attention away from the people sitting across the table from him. His father's passing had demonstrated, with a clarity that no amount of professional success could have delivered, that the people who shaped you cannot be replaced, and that the time available with them is not a renewable resource. That understanding, once it settles into a person, does not leave. It becomes part of how they see everything from that point forward. The public that had followed Mark Consuelos for nearly 3 decades responded to this chapter of his life with a recognition that went well beyond typical celebrity sympathy. Because grief over losing a parent is not an experience that belongs to any particular profession or income bracket or level of fame. It is one of the most universal things that human beings go through, and when someone the public has watched for a long time is visibly carrying it, the response tends to be genuine rather than performative. People connected Mark's experience to their own, saw their own losses reflected in his, and found in his story something that had nothing to do with television or celebrity at all. That kind of connection between a public figure and the people watching him, built not on glamour but on shared human experience, is one of the rarest and most meaningful things that can pass between them. At 55, Mark Consuelos was not defined by his career or his marriage or the decades of work that had made him one of the most recognizable faces in American television. He was defined by what he did with loss that could not be prepared for and could not be fixed, how he carried it with dignity, leaned on the people he loved, and allowed it to quietly clarify what his life was actually for. His father had given him the foundation. What Mark did with it, especially when it was tested most severely, was his own contribution to the story. And that story, beneath everything else, was never really about fame at all.